Nick aka Heretical Grey here, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be speaking about my life and experiences as someone who is raised as a Muslim and has left the religion. If I was to go through every single experience and incident, this video would last years, so instead I'm going to cover the main events in my life. I am in the process of writing a book where I will go a lot more in detail, so keep your eyes and ears open for that. Also, if you are here in an attempt to invalidate my experiences, you're a dick and don't bother. Alright, so let's begin. Given that I was raised in a blended family, both racially and religious, with a born Muslim father and a convert mother, my upbringing was quite different. We never had a direct influence from any particular culture, and everything we did had to be sourced from the Quran and the Hadith. We had to make sure that the context had been thoroughly researched, and Hadith had to be declared as Sahih with a followable chain of narration. A common question I would hear my parents ask is, "Where is that in Islam?" or "Show me your proof." As such, we were to begin prayer at 7, and once we hit puberty, we were no longer allowed to mix with those of the opposite gender. 7 is also when I began to wear the hijab. At first, it was just a small one tied under my chin, but as I got older, it became longer and longer, and more solid colours were introduced, which meant by the time I was 11, I was wearing a khimar with an abaya underneath. At one point, my mother tried to push me to wear gloves, but I resisted. I was 12 when I had my first period, and I remember staring at my stained underwear in dread. I knew what that meant. My childhood was over. I thought about not telling my mother, but it is very difficult to hide things from your parents when they were watching you 24/7. However, I was determined to not let wearing the niqab stop me. I would still run around with other children my age, playing games and climbing trees, until one day a Muslim man made a comment to my father about how inappropriate it was for me to be doing so. When we got home that day, I was told by my parents that I had embarrassed them, and that if I was going to do that, I would no longer be allowed to leave the house. I was forced to sit next to my mother whilst all my friends were able to run wild. I eventually became withdrawn and would just sit with all of the mothers, and my mother would lap up the praise from all the others about her well-behaved daughter, and I would feel myself breaking down inside. It wasn't long before I started to refuse to go out, which my mother was happy about because it meant that she could leave the children in the home with me, and I soon became the second mother. I would get quite bored. However, an advantage to this meant I had a lot of time to read through all of the Islamic texts that we had in the house. I quickly devoured Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih al-Muslim, Riyad al-Salihin, An-Nawawi, Ar-Rahiq al-Makhtoum, and Ibn al-Kathir. I read Quran every single day, memorizing surah after surah. I listened to Islamic scholars like Anwar al-Awlaki and Sheikh Faisal, Khalid Yassin, Abu Amina Bilal Phillips, Yusuf Estes, and so many more. Any questions I had, I would ask my parents, and they would answer me honestly. My parents never hid the darker aspects of Islam. They tried to explain them from a rational perspective, quite matter of fact. Ayaan Hirsi Ali deserved to die, not because she had insulted Islam, but because she was a murtad. Al-Qaeda were justified in the beheading of the kuffar because, well, they were the kuffar. The reason this was justified was after one of the battles in the early years of Islam, when Abu Bakr and Umar got into an argument over what to do with prisoners of war, and it was decided that executing them was acceptable. Slavery was a fact. Aisha was 9, but she'd been shown to Muhammad in dreams, which meant it was ordained by Allah. These things were all fact to me. By the time I was in early teens, I was aware of hudud. I knew what Sharia was. My family were trying their hardest to live a Sharia-compliant lifestyle as was possible in a Western country, but eventually it was becoming too hard, and after a number of arrests of my family's friends, we moved overseas to Somalia. This was the first time I had ever been overseas, and I will be honest with you, I loved it. I love Somalia and the people. If only their culture had not been washed away by years of colonizing, particularly more recently with the influence of Saudi money and Arabic Islamization. I still didn't attend school there, however I was allowed to attend madrasas, and this is where I was exposed to the hypocrisy of Muslims. Growing up, I had never been allowed to listen to music, but here I was seeing my muallima teaching Quran for a few hours and then going out and watching music videos with half-naked men and women gyrating on each other. I was confused. Good Muslims didn't do this. Only weak and sinning Muslims did. We lived in Somalia for 6 months until we eventually returned to Australia, and I missed Somalia. It was the only place where I was not under constant supervision. I could come and go as I pleased, visit my cousins, wander through the markets, or go treks through Boroma if I wanted to. In Australia, I was kept under lock and key. On return to Australia, my father began working at a private Islamic school where my other school-aged siblings were allowed to attend. For the life of me, I will never understand why my parents disallowed me from attending school, and I would remember asking them often. My mother would respond with with "I can teach you everything you need to know." I was only 14, but I knew that fighting was not going to achieve anything because it would be seen as disrespectful. It was around this age where I discovered fiction novels, particularly sci-fi and fantasy, reading these worlds of epic adventures were my escape from the harsh reality of my life. But soon these books were banned for me as they were regarded as haram. They had magic, they had mixing, they had kissing, they had romance. These things were all haram for me to be reading. So I began to write my own stories, losing myself in a world of my own imagination. I would create these strong and powerful female characters who were able to overcome anything and everything that was thrown at them. They were defiant against their society's norms, and they were brave, and they were never weak. And I created these women because I needed superheroes, because I was scared, because I was weak. My world turned upside down in early 2007. It was a very hot day in the high 30 degrees Celsius, and my mother had gone out to the local supermarket with a few of my siblings. She came home just before lunch and started cooking it. My brother was playing RuneScape on the computer, and 3 of my youngest siblings were upstairs watching Sinbad. When we all came down for lunch, I remember asking where my younger sister M was. My sister F said that she thought she was sleeping. My mother didn't question it, and neither did I, as this was normally the time that M would have her nap. After lunch, and out of curiosity, I began looking around for her. We had a rather large home, so it took me some time to check all of the bedrooms, and I remember coming downstairs and telling my mother that I couldn't find M anywhere. My mother said I was being silly and proceeded to check all the rooms I had just gone through. Panic began to escalate as my mother and I started calling her name and looking everywhere. My mother ran out the front screaming her name, fearing that her little baby had run out the front door. Part of me wanted to look in the backyard, but I asked my mother to do it. I will never forget the anguish in my mother's voice as she screamed my name from the backyard. I ran out the door and saw her pulling the limp body of my 2-year-old baby sister from the car. I grabbed the phone and dialed 000, and with my voice shaking, requested an ambulance. My mother ran into the house and placed my sister's body down in the study. I ran upstairs, and just as my youngest siblings were hearing the commotion were trying to come down, I remember dragging them back up the stairs into the bedroom and telling them, "If you believe in Allah, start praying, but whatever they did, do not come back downstairs until I get them." My brother R walked into the living room, and seeing my mother attempting CPR and my sister collapse on the ground screaming, I ran over to him and just stood there. My mother was screaming down the phone, demanding to know where the ambulance was. She left my sister's body and ran out the front looking for the ambulance. I picked up the phone, and the woman on the other end asked me if I knew how to do CPR. I replied with yes, and she said that I had to keep doing it until the ambulance arrived. Only a few months prior had I obtained a first aid certificate, so I remember placing my palm on her tiny chest, and I began compressions. As I leant down to give her breath, I can distinctly remember the smell of vomit as she had thrown up in the car, but I didn't stop because I didn't want to lose my baby sister. Soon the ambulance arrived, and they moved my sister into the living room and began trying to save her life. They pumped her with adrenaline to get her heart started again, but they eventually made the call to go to the hospital. My mother left with my brother R, and I didn't hear anything from them until later that evening. I called my mother's friends, and I started telling them what had happened. One of my mum's friends must have seen something going on in the street. I don't really remember, but she was at the house within 15 minutes. And I just went upstairs and I held onto my siblings with the TV on in the background. It wasn't long before media showed up at our house, setting up their cameras and knocking on our doors. My mother's friend called some of my father's friends, and within half an hour, the local Lebanese and Palestinian boys had shown up with their SUVs and sports cars and parked them all around our house, obscuring the media's view. They also stood around the house and kicked any media off the property as they tried to sneak in. Soon, my living room was filled with the wives of all the men from all different backgrounds. They brought food, and I walked around giving people water and drinks. I went back upstairs and was flicking through TV channels, and I saw the 4:30 p.m. news bulletin. A toddler has died after being abandoned in the family car. And it flashed to our house, and that was how I knew that my sister had died. A little bit later that day, my father called the house and I picked up the phone. He asked where my mother was and I just blurted out that M had died. He responded with La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, and one of the aunties took the phone off me and explained to him what had happened. My mother came home and sat in the living room surrounded by her friends, and I just went and sat in my own room and cried myself to sleep. A few days after my sister's janazah, I remember realizing how short life was, how we should fight for the lives that we want, and I made a promise to myself that I would never stop fighting, that I was never going to let anything defeat me. I wasn't going to let them defeat me. I was going to fight with everything I had, and I was going to live my life on my terms. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today to listen to part 2 of my life and experiences. Part 3 will be out in a week's time. In the meantime, if you are wanting to reach out to me, feel free to contact me on Twitter or Instagram at Heretical Gray. Again, thank you so much for listening today, and bye!